Those calling for the Prime Minister's deal to be supported included the National Farmers Union of Scotland, the Scottish Chambers of Commerce, the Scotch Whisky Association, the Scottish Fishermen's Federation and the CBI. First Minister, are they traitors too?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, the Prime Minister's deal is a bad deal for the UK and certainly a bad deal for Scotland. Let me just recap. It would take Scotland out of the EU against our will, out of the single market, out of the customs union with no clarity about the future relationship with the EU. I don't think any MP with the best interests of Scotland at heart should vote for that proposition. But I would say gently to Jackson Carlaw, even if every single SNP MP had voted for the deal earlier in the week, it would still have been heavily defeated because the Prime Minister failed to persuade so many in her own side. Indeed, she's failing to persuade those in her own cabinet. But Jackson Carlaw mentions the National Farmers Union. Here's what they said yesterday about the tariff schedule that was published by the UK government. They said that it undermines the food security of the UK. What an appalling set of circumstances. And of course, they also wrote to every Scottish MP urging them to take no deal off the table. So perhaps Jackson Carlaw would like to explain to the Chamber and to the public today why, with just one exception, and I'm not talking about David Mundell, with one exception, none of the Scottish Tory MPs voted last night in the House of Commons to take no deal off the table. That is what was utterly shameful, and perhaps Jackson Carlaw would care to explain it.
Jackson Carlaw.
Presiding Officer, on Tuesday of this week, the SNP Cabinet Secretary Michael Russell, sitting just next to her, accused those who backed the Prime Minister's deal as being traitors to Scotland. As ever, he thought he was being clever. He hid the accusation behind a hashtag, but that's the charge he made. Surely the First Minister will disassociate herself from this inflammatory smear, and it's telling that she is not. But there is an important point here. There are many of us in Scotland, in politics and outside, who do back the Prime Minister's deal. Will the First Minister at least accept that we think it is what's best for our country, and we do so in all good faith?
First Minister.
Do you know, I genuinely am struggling to believe that Jackson Carlaw is coming here to talk about a Twitter hashtag when the government led by his party is in meltdown, is a shambles and is taking this country ever closer to the cliff edge. On the question of the historical Ragman Row, however, he might be interested to know Robert the Bruce actually signed it. If David Mundell ever wants to get any of the spirit of Robert the Bruce, then I'm sure all of us would warmly welcome that. But the fact of the matter is, Presiding Officer, with the exception of Paul Masterton, the honourable exception of Paul Masterton, every single Scottish Conservative MP has chosen to put loyalty to the Prime Minister ahead of the interests of the Scottish people. I'm afraid that is a fact. And I'll give Jackson Carlaw another opportunity to explain why all of them refused, with one exception last night, to vote to take no deal off the table. Businesses like the one I was visiting in Glasgow yesterday, the Farmers Union, interest the length and breadth of the country, wanted all Scotland's MPs to take no deal off the table. Why did Scottish Tories refuse to do that?
Jackson Carlaw.
Presiding Officer, I'm asking her to enhance the dignity of her office. She's chosen not to do so. Presiding Officer, many joined the business organisations I mentioned in backing the deal earlier this week because we believe it is a good deal which offers certainty for business in the country. I respect the views of those who disagree, but they now have a duty to spell out their alternative way forward. The First Minister's preference is to support a second UK Brexit referendum, but it begs so many more questions. What would be the options? When Leave or Remain wins this time, shall we make it best of three? How would this delay guarantee people and businesses the certainty they need and which the First Minister talked about last night? And would she accept the result? Or is all of this, as many of us suspect, just a prelude to yet another referendum, the one she really wants?
First Minister.
Well, I think the result of the 2016 Brexit referendum in Scotland should have been accepted, because Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain in the European Union. Can I remind him again, though, and this is where Jackson Carlaw, or one of the many areas where Jackson Carlaw is really struggling here, not surprisingly, given the mess the Tories are making, not just of Brexit, but of the entire UK right now. If every single SNP MP had voted for the Prime Minister's deal on Tuesday night, it would still have gone down to a heavy defeat, because she has not managed to persuade those in her own party, let alone anyone else. And in terms of spelling out a way forward, I spent 2 years, more than 2 years, suggesting compromise to the Prime Minister. Single market, customs union, compromise. That was cast aside, ignored and dismissed, as every vote in this Parliament on the issue has been cast aside, ignored and dismissed by the Tory government. But the way forward now, yes, is to put this issue back to the people. Parliament has failed to resolve this issue. And if Parliament can't decide, the people should. So that's what I think is the way forward, and it's a better way forward than the Prime Minister trying to bully the House of Commons into accepting a bad deal. She should accept defeat, change course and open her mind now to the right way forward.
Jackson Carlaw.
Not that this First Minister has ever sought to bully this Parliament when they've been defeated on issues. But we have accepted the result of all referendums. The First Minister has accepted the result of none. The blunt truth is the First Minister will only accept the result of a referendum, any one, if it goes her way. I back a deal that gives our fishing communities the sea of opportunity they want, a deal supported by our whisky industry, giving them frictionless trade across the continent, a deal that our farmers say will ensure there are no hard barriers to our biggest market. All these Scottish organisations, and many all across Scotland, are telling us to back the deal and get this done. Isn't it time to respect the result, back an orderly Brexit? The whole country gets a chance then to move on.
First Minister.
I do respect the outcome of the 2016 referendum. Scotland voted to remain in the EU. That is the best outcome for Scotland. And if the Tories, for once in their life, could ever find it within themselves to stand up for Scotland rather than standing up for a beleaguered Prime Minister, then they would also recognise it's the best future for Scotland. Frankly, it is deluded for anyone to suggest that there is majority support across Scotland for the Prime Minister's deal. There is not support for leaving the EU. There is certainly not support for leaving on the basis of such a profoundly bad deal. The Prime Minister's deal has been defeated overwhelmingly in the House of Commons, not just once but twice. It is time for her to accept that defeat and open her mind now to an alternative way forward. Let's get no deal properly off the table. Let's seek a lengthy extension to allow this issue to go back to the people. If the Conservatives were listening, not to their bosses in Westminster, but if they were listening to majority opinion across Scotland, that's exactly what the Conservatives would be arguing for. And I think it is to their great discredit that they are failing to do that, that they are indeed failing Scotland.
Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
Presiding Officer, last night the House of Commons voted to oppose a no-deal Brexit. But as the law stands, we will still be leaving the European Union on the 29th of March with no deal. The First Minister and I agree that no deal would be a disaster. 2 years of Theresa May claiming that no deal is better than a bad deal is nothing less than a lie. Does the First Minister agree with me that despite last night's vote, no deal remains an immediate and a very real danger?
Be careful with the language, Mr Leonard. First Minister.
Yes, I do. Richard Leonard is right to point out that notwithstanding the vote in the House of Commons last night, the legal default is no deal on the 29th of March, which is why I think the government should be coming forward now with a proposition to change the law so that the UK does not crash out of the EU on the 29th of March with no deal, and I hope he would support that proposition. But I also think it's important for those who oppose the Prime Minister's deal, for those of us, which I think includes Richard Leonard, who oppose Brexit, to come together now to find a better way forward. And I say to him, I hope in a constructive spirit, that, and ask him if he can use his influence with Jeremy Corbyn to get Jeremy Corbyn firmly behind the option of a second EU referendum, because if he would come off the fence, then I think that option would become not just the best one, but the most likely next step. So will he, perhaps this afternoon, get on the phone to Jeremy Corbyn and ask him to, at long last on the issue of Brexit, start showing some leadership?
Mr Leonard, can I just ask you... Mr Leonard, can I just ask you not to use the term lie, even about people outside, or particularly about people outside this chamber? Mr Leonard.
Okay. Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I just remind the Chamber that last week in this Parliament, all parties voted to reject no deal in all circumstances, with the sole exception of the Tories. What does it say about the Tories in here that every single one of them, without exception, voted for something that neither the Secretary of State for Scotland nor Jackson Carlow's own MP could support last night?
Absolutely.
But the reality is this: without a majority in the Commons for an alternative, no deal remains a threat. So does the First Minister agree with me that tonight members of Parliament must vote for Article 50 to be extended long enough to allow for a majority in Parliament to be formed in favour of a different approach?
First Minister.
Yes, and SNP MPs have been laying amendments to that effect, and will vote for exactly that. In fact, I think it is time for the House of Commons to take control of this out of the hands of the Prime Minister and the Government, and to make sure that a sensible way forward is found. I agree wholeheartedly with Richard Leonard about the Scottish Conservatives. He's right to say this Parliament voted overwhelmingly to reject no deal last week, and this Parliament again is being ignored, not just by the Government but by Scottish Tory MPs. I think it is to his credit that Paul Masterton did the right thing last night. The Secretary of State for Scotland, though, can't even manage to rebel properly. He pathetically opted for an abstention to save his own job rather than properly standing up for this country, and that, I think, is a disgrace. But on the issue of the way forward, I say again to Richard Leonard, because I think we probably agree on more than we disagree on this issue, but Jeremy Corbyn surely has to start showing real leadership here, because it is, even at this stage, not entirely clear to me what would be different about the situation the UK is in just now if Jeremy Corbyn was leading the Brexit negotiations rather than Theresa May. The way to break the parliamentary deadlock is to put this issue back to the people. So I hope Richard Leonard will seek to persuade his leader that that is the option that should be backed, and then we can build a majority around that and find a better, the right way forward, not just for Scotland, but for the whole of the UK.
Richard Leonard.
Well, Jeremy Corbyn's made it clear that the House of Commons has got two options. It's got the option of securing a better deal or taking it back to the people. That's the Labour Party position. We know that the House of Commons does not want two things. It does not want no deal, and it does not want Theresa May's deal. But the Prime Minister still isn't listening, and she says that she wants to bring back her deal back for a third time, even though the deal is dead. Does the First Minister agree with me that the Prime Minister cannot keep asking the same question until she gets the answer that she wants?
First Minister.
Yes, I agree with that. One of the favourite catchphrases of the Tories is we said no and we mean it. Perhaps they should start applying it to the Prime Minister and the Government in London. But I'd say to Richard Leonard about the two options he says the House of Commons has, one of which, according to him, is a better deal. There is no good Brexit deal. A Labour Brexit will not be better or less damaging to Scotland than a Tory Brexit. It is Brexit that will do the damage to Scotland, and that is why we should be seeking to honour the vote of the Scottish people and reverse Brexit if we possibly can. So I hope we will be able to put a majority behind a second EU referendum so that people, not just in Scotland but across the UK, knowing everything that is now known about Brexit, can take that opportunity to keep the UK and to keep Scotland where it belongs, which is within the European Union.
Yeah. We have some constituency supplementaries. The first from Tavish Scott, to be followed by Bob Doris.
Presiding Officer, the internationally recognised Fair Isle Bird Observatory was destroyed by fire last weekend. Thankfully, no one was injured, despite the valiant efforts of firefighters from across Shetland and the Fair Isle team led by Fiona Mitchell. The home that is David and Susanna Parnaby's was completely destroyed. Would the First Minister accept that Fair Isle is the kind of island that gets on and wants to move forward, and their intention is to rebuild the observatory? And will her government please provide every assistance towards that? Will she also ensure that lessons are learnt from the Fair Isle fire for the emergency services in supporting fires in islands where there's no full-time fire cover? And finally, would you recognise that 3 out of the 9 local firefighting team are French? These brave women are having to apply to stay in Fair Isle because of the omni-shambles that is Brexit.
First Minister.
Well, on that last point, before I come on to the substantive issue, I agree wholeheartedly with Tavish Scott. It is outrageous, in my view, that any EU national who has made Scotland, any part of Scotland, their home, is having to apply for the right to stay here. But the circumstances that he has outlined, I think, underlines just how shameful that situation is. More generally, Presiding Officer, can I thank Tavish Scott for raising this issue and say that my thoughts are very much with all those connected with the Fair Isle Bird Observatory Trust at this very, very sad time, particularly the warden's family, who, of course, sadly lost their home in the fire. As Tavish Scott said, we must be thankful, of course, that there were no casualties. Incidents like this remind us of the bravery and professionalism of our firefighters. I note Tavish Scott's point, and we will reflect on the point about the island with no full-time fire cover. But this was a good example of an effective multi-agency response, and the Coast Guard, Shetland Isles Council were both assisting firefighters in reaching the scene. Obviously, investigations into the cause of the fire are underway, and we must await the outcome of those inquiries. And thankfully, the wealth of bird census data collected since 1948 are digitised and backed up safely.